Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Grace Estrada, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 7, Emerging Adulthood. It will be the overview and physical changes. So let's go ahead and I will share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to be covering Chapter 7, Emerging Adulthood, Overview and Physical Development. First of all, here are some objectives. We're going to explain emerging adulthood, explain how emerging adulthood differs from adolescence and adulthood, talk about cultural variations of emerging adulthood, identify markers of adulthood, and identify where emerging and early adults currently live. So before we get started, I think it's a good idea to just think to yourself, what makes you feel like an adult? At what point did you feel like you were fully grown up? So let's think about that. All right, when does adulthood begin? Traditionally, we consider people adults when they got married or they became parents. What has happened, though, is economic and social changes have really affected those factors and how often people engage in those activities. So what we see are people are delaying marriage and parenthood and instead extending their education. So now, instead of marriage and parenthood being the main markers of adulthood, we're looking at financial independence and self-responsibility instead. However, there are definitely some socioeconomic and cultural differences in terms of when we consider people adults. So let's look at some cultural variations. First of all, when we talk about culture, we're really looking at society. And when we talk about how a social environment is existing, it really is influenced by governmental policies and programs. So when you have a situation where college education is free, when people have unemployment benefits and housing allowances, that really encourages them to pursue education, right? They have a reason for going back to school. Also, what influences when people become adults, in society, is whether that society is individualistic or collectivistic in their views. If a society is individualistic, what it values is financial independence and the freedom to explore one's identity and leisure. Really, the focus is on the individual. That's why it's called individualistic. On the other hand, in a collectivistic society, what we're looking at is the person able to financially help their parents? The emphasis is not so much on independence and leisure, but more about how much can you contribute to your family and to your community. So you see that those are very different approaches. So technically, adulthood, we consider beginning in the early 20s and ends with old age and death. If you think about it, the traditional divisions of adulthood are young or early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. However, we can actually break down those traditional categories. So, for example, we have stages of young adulthood. Emerging adulthood is considered between the ages of 18 and 25. It's sort of an in-between period of adolescence and full adulthood. Early adulthood is age 26 and 45, and then we have late adulthood is broken into middle and late adulthood are broken into other categories as well. So Jeffrey Arnett was the researcher who came up with this idea of emerging adulthood. And through his research, he realized that, this age between 18 and 25 really is special. So he considered it an age of identity exploration, a time when people are making decisions in school or career or both in terms of what they want to do with their life. Age of instability. So this is when people start to maybe change jobs, try different jobs, change relationships, change where they live. And so that idea of instability goes hand in hand with that identity exploration. Age of self-focus. So unlike egocentrism in early childhood and adolescence, we consider this the age of self-focus, not self-centeredness. So self-focus meaning that emerging adults are really considering, the choices they have. They have their whole life ahead of them. What do they want to do? but they're also considering how those choices impact their loved ones, their parents, their siblings, their significant others. So although they are focused on what it is they want to do with the rest of their lives, they're also considering how those decisions impact their loved ones. Age of feeling in between. So oftentimes emerging adults feel like they are past adolescence, right? They're not little kids anymore. But on the other hand, they don't feel fully adult. Maybe they can't financially support themselves yet, or they don't feel ready through experience or knowledge to make major life decisions. And that's what we mean by feeling in between, not quite a child, but not yet a full adult. Age of possibilities. Yes, as I mentioned, this is a wonderful stage where you have your whole life ahead of you. Now you can make decisions in terms of where you want to live, the career you want to have, the people you want to live with. It's just really the possibilities are vast when you're at this age. It's a really exciting time of life. So what is it that makes emerging adulthood possible? First of all, it's controversial because it does not exist in every single society. There are certain factors that contribute to where it is observed in our society. First of all, delayed marriage and childbearing due to societal tolerance of premarital sex and entrance of women into high status careers. Wow, that's a huge factor. So in many more conservative societies, the expectation is that once people, leave adolescence or of childbearing age, they're expected to get married and have kids. When that happens, having that opportunity to explore the possibilities, their identity, the career, it really limits it. So in order for emerging adulthood to occur, you have to have a society that recognizes that it is important to have, education, have choices, and also that getting married too early and having kids really impedes that. Secondly, increased numbers in college and graduate school. So in other words, the economy is based on information, not industrial components. So if you are in a society that values information, then it's going to encourage people to pursue their educations much more. The career is delayed or unstable due to longer schooling and global economic fluctuations. When the economy is down, when there aren't very many jobs, oftentimes people choose to go back to school to either learn new skills or make themselves more valuable somehow, or completely shift careers. So oftentimes what you'll find in these situations is that actually starting the career is delayed. And so people just choose to stay in school a little bit longer. So that is another factor for emerging adulthood to emerge. And finally, economic wealth allows for personal exploration in delays in adult responsibilities. A society has to be fairly well off to be able to support people when they decide to stay in school longer and not work. I mean, think about it, that costs money. Being able to pay rent or being able to live in a place and not worry too much about rent, that really requires a certain amount of economic wealth in the society and people's families. So these are the 4 social factors that contribute to the development of emerging adulthood: delayed marriage and childbearing, increased numbers of college and graduate school, in other words, having an information economy, people delaying their careers or, because of schooling or global economic fluctuations, and finally, a certain level of economic wealth in that society. All right, so physical development. In early adulthood, it is a wonderful time because physical maturation is complete. You're really at your peak in your 20s physiologically. It's the time when you can gain muscle and strength much easier than any other time. It doesn't mean it's the only time, but physiologically speaking, this is the best time in terms of athleticism. So your muscle strength, reaction time, sensory abilities, and cardiac functioning are all at their peak. And so you'll see many Olympic athletes or professional athletes are in their 20s because they have that capability unlike any other time. The reproductive system, motor skills, strength, and lung capacity are also all operating at their best. In our 30s, so 20s is 1 decade, right? And it goes very quickly. The lens of the eye starts to stiffen and thicken. In fact, if you have to wear glasses to be able to read or to see distance, you might find that temporarily your prescription will improve because of this stiffening and thickening. That's temporarily. Your sensitivity to sound decreases. So you start to find people will ask you to speak louder or maybe put the TV up a little bit louder in order to be able to hear. Hair starts to thin and to become gray. And we'll talk about that. Skin becomes drier and wrinkles start to appear. That would be preventable, totally preventable, using moisturizer and hydrating enough with water. What do you see also are declines in response time, the ability to recover from physical exertion. So it takes a lot longer to rest and maybe, recover from an all-nighter or something. Immune system functioning is also declined. So you have to be more wary in terms of not getting sick. And reproductive capacity declines as well. Fun, right? Okay, some challenges in early adulthood. Well, because of this whole situation with college and kind of the time that people have available to them and less supervision, we have certain challenges that are particular in early adulthood. So first of all, obesity. Early adulthood is actually the prime time to gain weight. 39.8% of Americans in 2016 were obese. And a lot of it has to do with the environment, people that they hang out with, behavior, and also there's a genetic component as well. And there are many, many health conditions associated with obesity. Very consistently, research really supports the idea that the lighter you are, the less difficult it is for your body to continue working. And so you don't have things like diabetes, cardiac problems, cholesterol issues. So you want to really try to maintain a lean body weight as much as possible, purely for health reasons, if nothing else. Alcohol use and abuse is also a huge challenge in early adulthood. 88% of people over the age of 18 have, drank alcohol. It's not to mean that they're abusing it necessarily. 25% admit to binge drinking. And the problem with binge drinking is that it's associated with two very serious issues, as drunk driving and sexual assault. So 80% of drunk driving and sexual assault incidences involve the use of alcohol. Drug use is also, becomes prevalent in early adulthood. It usually peaks between 19 and 22 years old. So if you can get past that little stage, the chances of you having problems with drugs really decrease. What do we find? Ages 18 to 25 are the largest abusers of opioid drug abuse. And all of this is associated with having a violent death, sexually transmitted infections, and also birth defects, right? If you don't realize that you're going to, maybe you're engaging in sexual activity and you're not using protection and you're using drugs, you can very well end up pregnant and not really be in a state that is healthy for the child. And remember, for women, that oftentimes by the time they realize they're pregnant, they've missed their period, that critical period of development has already passed. And so you see quite a few birth defects associated with drug use. I would also say between 18 and 25, people get their wisdom teeth taken out. And there was actually a recent special regarding the prescription of opioids to address the pain after surgery. And what is really remarkable is that using extra strength Tylenol and ibuprofen are actually more effective than taking, very strong drugs or narcotics to deal with pain from things like wisdom tooth surgery. So it's something to keep in mind that there are some people who are susceptible to becoming addicted. They actually start because they had something like a wisdom teeth taken out and they were prescribed painkillers to deal with it. And then they just became addicted from there. So as much as possible, avoid the use of opioids completely. even if it's for something legitimate like surgery, it's better to deal with ice, ibuprofen, and acetaminophen to deal with the pain. Right, college students and alcohol use. This is especially an issue in colleges where people are residents, in dorms and things like that. About 20% of college students meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, and 80% of college sexual assaults involved alcohol. So this is both on the victim side. Oftentimes they drink too much and then are not in a position, or they're incapable of defending themselves or really saying no. And then there's those who are the perpetrators who maybe drank too much, and then that encourages them to engage in behaviors that they normally wouldn't. So unfortunately, when people are in college, there's a lot of peer pressure to engage in alcohol. And it's sort of, it's a stereotype and an expectation that if you're in college, you're going to be drinking. What else becomes problematic is there's not a lot of adult supervision, right? So this could be the very first time that people are away from home. And so that temptation of, engaging in alcohol, going to parties and things like that becomes really big, and it leads to really bad situations. Unstructured time. So in between classes, or maybe, during breaks, if you're just hanging around, that also encourages this kind of situation where people are abusing alcohol. And the active Greek system and athletic program, those are especially prone to sort of encouraging this behavior. And so people who are in these fraternities or sororities tend to be more susceptible to be abusing alcohol. And also, if you are in a athletic program, football, basketball, things like that, again, that environment sort of encourages this behavior, and it's very problematic. All right, so in emerging adulthood, remember, you're making a lot of choices at this stage. And so one of them could be about your orientation, or maybe the gender you identify with. So when we talk about sex, what we're talking about is the physical or physiological differences between male and female. On the other hand, gender is a social cultural distinction associated with a given sex. So our perception of what it means to be female, so female is the sex, our perception of what it means to be female is the gender, and that is very much influenced by our society and our culture. So a gender role is how society conceives how men and women are expected to act and behave. So sometimes you might see if a woman, for example, in a very conservative society is engaged in construction work, that would be, maybe considered very unusual and maybe looked down upon in that particular society. So gender identity is your sense of self as a member of a particular gender. So if you identify as female, that might be your gender identity. It is separate from sexual orientation. So those who are female identified are not necessarily heterosexual, right? Those who are male identified. So it's really important to know the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. So remember, sex is biological, physiological. Gender is socially and culturally constructed. And it's kind of like, what is it that makes a difference between someone being male and someone being female? A gender role is how society conceives people to behave in a particular gender. And gender identity is how you relate to yourself as a female, male, or non-binary. Cisgender is the term we use to when somebody identifies with their role that corresponds to the sex assigned to them at birth. So the doctor says you're female and you identify as female, then we call that cisgender. Transgender is when you identify with a role that is different from your biological sex. So that might be somebody who's biologically male identifying as female, or someone who's biologically female identifying as male. And then, of course, there's an entire spectrum in between. So in terms of adulthood, we generally call the category of people's interest and attraction to others human sexuality. It includes not just their interest, but also the capacity to have erotic experiences and responses, and it can be expressed in many different ways. So sexuality has the biological and physical component, really meaning specific body parts we're talking about. There's the emotional component. Oxytocin is released when you know, it's kind of called the love neurotransmitter. And when you engage in even touching, not necessarily completely the whole sexual act, oxytocin does get released. There's the social aspect of sexuality and how you present yourself. And then even there's a spiritual aspect to sexuality, how you feel afterwards. And so there's an entire sort of different aspect to sexuality when we talk about it in a spiritual sense. It's just important to understand that sexuality is not only biological and physical, although that's what many people focus on. So Masters and Johnson, 1966, were the researchers who came up with this, who actually mapped out what a sexual response cycle looks like. So what it is it starts off as the arousal increases, then you go through these different stages. So there are 4 stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. So excitement, the arousal starts to build. Plateau is exactly what it sounds like. It kind of starts leveling off. It doesn't really go up more. After you, a certain amount of time, hopefully you go past the plateau, and then the excitement level increases to the point where someone has orgasm, or that's like a sexual release of all the tension that's building up. And then after the orgasm is resolution. So it's really interesting because people often, when we talk about sex, people talk about genitalia, and they don't realize actually the brain is very involved in sex. So the brain is what translates those nerve impulses into pleasurable sensations. Without your brain, you know, the rest of your body isn't going to feel anything, right? What's involved is your cerebral cortex, your limbic system, and your hypothalamus when we talk about, you know, what's going on with the brain. The brain controls your nerves and muscles used in sexual activity. I mean, it makes sense, but people forget about it. The libido is what we refer to as someone's general desire for sexual activity, and that's very much influenced by the hormones that are being released. So here you have kind of an overall look at the different endocrine glands and hormones that are involved when we talk about sexual activity. You are not responsible for knowing these. I just wanted to give you an example of, like, there is a lot going on in your brain when we talk about sexual activity, and many people don't even realize that. So in terms of sexual responsiveness, for men, they peak in their late teens and early 20s. So after 20s, it starts to decline in terms of responsiveness. On the other hand, for women are on a different kind of cycle, and their responsiveness peaks in the 30s or 40s. So you see there's a little bit of a disconnect here. And what people believe is that responsiveness in late 30s or early 40s increases because women are less likely to be worried about, you know, becoming pregnant. They're more established and have more confidence, maybe less inhibition. So it was a lot of it really does have to do with their brain and their own mentality in terms of how open they are to sexual experiences. So can't leave out sexually transmitted infections. It used to be called STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and now we refer to them as STIs, sexually transmitted infections. So these are illnesses that have a significant probability of being transmitted through sexual behavior. So in 2014, there were 1.4 million cases of chlamydia, 350,000 cases of gonorrhea, and 20,000 cases of syphilis. For quite some time, we really focused on AIDS, right? HIV infections, but that's not the only infection that you can get. And so people are forgetting that there are these other illnesses that are not pleasant at all to have. And so it's important to keep that in mind, and you want to protect against it, right? So there has been an increase in, you know, incidences of sexually transmitted infections, and who is most affected are younger people, those who are gay, bisexual, maybe pansexual, males and females. So really, the more promiscuous you are, the more you're engaging in it, you need to be careful. And so it's really important to use protection to avoid it. Most effective way to prevent STIs is practicing safe sex. You want to avoid direct contact of skin or fluids, and that's through using a condom. Cultural and societal views on sexuality. Well, a lot of times how sexuality is viewed is influenced by religion. So if you are in a society that has one specific prevalent religion, that's going to really affect how the rest of the people in that society behave. Oftentimes, we underestimate how much media shapes our views of sexuality, body image. So the more we view unrealistic body images, that really affects our own ideas of our own body and also impacts sexuality. Social scripts about relationships. A social script is an example when men are expected to pay for a date. That's a social script. And women are expected, to maybe the more the man pays for dinner, the more is expected from them. That is a social script. It's not an acceptable social script in my mind, but it is a social script that exists. And we have certain ideas in terms of sexuality of what is acceptable for men and what's acceptable for women. Traditionally, men are considered to be, it's acceptable for them to be more assertive, more aggressive when it comes to sexuality, and women are supposed to be more submissive. And so this is all influenced by culture and religion. So views and practices also about premarital sex, meaning sex before you get married, and living together really differs greatly across cultures. And also who's allowed to engage in these activities together, if it's purely heterosexual is acceptable or anything like that, and who's allowed to live together and be accepted. Those, again, are influenced by our culture and society. So in terms of orientation, remember, so we have gender identification that's different from sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is really who it is that you are sexually attracted to. If somebody is heterosexual, then they are attracted to individuals of the quote unquote opposite sex or gender, meaning males attracted to females, females attracted to males. Homosexuality, on the other hand, is when attraction is to one's own sex or gender. So that would be females attracted to other females, males attracted to other males. Bisexuality, well, this is kind of an outdated term, right? This is when we considered that there are only two sexes, male and female. And so attraction would be to both males and females. Now we recognize that there is really the spectrum. And so the term that's more often used is pansexuality or polysexuality, which goes beyond just male and female and includes non-binary attractions as well. And then there is asexuality, in which somebody is not attracted, sexually attracted to anybody at all. So heteronormative is what is it that is considered the quote unquote norm in society. In most societies, heterosexuality is what is considered the norm in terms of sexual orientation. Okay, so in terms of developing that knowledge or awareness of sexual orientation, usually the awareness develops in early adolescence. People start to feel attracted to others, right? And it's not necessary to have experience with, dating other people before you realize kind of who you're attracted to. There is a belief that sexual orientation has a biological basis. There is a maternal immune hypothesis, and that hypothesis indicates some research shows that the Y-linked protein changes with births of subsequent sons. And so the more sons a woman has, there's an increased likelihood of those later sons becoming homosexual because their uterus develops an immunity to the Y-linked protein, which is really a fascinating finding. So overall physical development in early adulthood, it's wonderful because you're at your physical maturity, you're at physical peak. That's in your 20s. Decline starts in late 30s, but again, there's so much you can do to avoid, a lot of the decline. Some of the challenges in early adulthood have to do with obesity, alcohol use, and drug use. And also in early adulthood, really sexuality comes to a forefront. So people really start to kind of settle on their gender roles, gender identity. Sexual responsiveness becomes more of an issue for people, and sexual orientation. This is often a time when people make that decision. So I hope this is helpful, and I will see you next time. And we're going to talk about cognitive changes. Take care.